Okay, well, maybe we'll move into our two presentations that we planned for today. And we were thinking about having a topic for today for discussion about some of the warming ocean temperatures that have been observed and some of the unusual events that might be linked to those warming events happening in the ocean environment. And so two presenters were available, and thanks so much for being here today. The first who's going to start is Jesika Reimer, who's an assistant zoologist at the Alaska Center for Conservation Science here in Anchorage. And I was made aware of an article in the Cordova Times that talked about some of the work that she and her colleagues are doing, which includes some great summaries that are on the Bering Invaders Project, which is a link off the agenda there. And then following that, Rob Kaler, who's a wildlife biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, will talk about a really broad-scale collaborative program with different agencies and different groups across the state to look into seabird die-off events that have been happening in the Bering Sea and also in the northern Gulf of Alaska. So Jesika, if you want to start, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having us. I'll just try to pull this up here. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. So with me today, let me see here. With me today is Amanda Drogini, who's also co-author on a lot of this work. And yeah, thanks for having us out. We're just getting into the final stages of submitting our final report and all of the data and all of that kind of stuff to NPRB, who funded this project. So it's fun to be able to take a break and chat about it a little bit. So I'm not sure if anyone knows too much about what we've been doing, but basically we've been doing a risk assessment for marine invasive species in the Bering Sea. And obviously 15 minutes isn't a lot of time, so I'm going to touch briefly on everything that we've done for the project. And if you want more information on the methods, the data, the results, that will all be available on our website, or you can contact either of us to get more information as well. So, I mean, we all know the Bering Sea is a really valuable resource. It supports industry, communities, subsistence, a lot of important cultural history. And so when we think about invasive species coming in, it raises some concerns. And so today I'll be using the term invasive species and non-native species a little bit interchangeably. But the big thing with invasive species are that they're non-native species, so they're not originally from the Bering Sea. They spread rapidly, and they typically cause damage, either ecological, economic, or to human health. And so non-native species can come into a new place and be relatively benign, and therefore they wouldn't be considered invasive. But with the kind of the defining feature seems to be that if they cause damage, we consider them invasive. And so for our study, we looked at marine species only because we were interested in the Bering Sea, and we looked at animals. We didn't look at plants too much. And so the history of the Bering Sea is basically it's relatively pristine. There are a few non-native species. There have only been 4 that we could find occurrence records for, and really it's just the Japanese skeleton shrimp, which you can see down here, and the soft-shell clam that have had established populations in the Bering Sea. So far, Bering Sea seems to be like it's doing okay. The idea behind this is that because of the geographic isolation, the cold temperatures, the sea ice, all of these create barriers to invasive species, both arriving as well as establishing when they get here. And so as was mentioned, climate is changing, seas are warming, and so this is a model that was, or a map produced by NOAA, and it basically, the idea here is that northern latitudes are changing more rapidly than southern latitudes. So you can see up in the Bering Sea here, the projections say that it's going to be getting a lot warmer. And the idea behind climate warming is that it creates a more favorable environment for invasive species. So for the last 50 years, studies have shown that we're seeing warming in the Bering Sea already. We see reduced ice cover, reduced ice extent, and increasing temperatures. And this warming trend is expected to continue according to a lot of the projections that have been coming out. And so the thing about climate change, as I mentioned, is that it can increase the susceptibility of an area to invasions. And it can do this in a few different ways. One can be range shifts. So you can have a species that was previously limited maybe by temperature into an area, and now they can move further north. So they can expand their range into new areas. Through ocean acidification, we can have native species that die off or that are reduced in their populations, and that can create space and reduced predation or competition for invasive species to then move into an area, whereas before they may have been excluded because the local populations prevented them from coming in. Also, increased human activity with shipping. The thing about invasive species is they really love to hitch rides with humans. And so as the sea ice retreats, Northwest Passage opens up, as more boats are coming into the Bering Sea, it creates more opportunities for these invasive species to move into the area. And so what we wanted to do was do this risk assessment for the Bering Sea. Prevention and early detection have been shown time and time again are the best tools for managing invasive species. And as I mentioned with the Bering Sea, it's still relatively pristine in terms of invasives. And so being able to monitor and prevent things from coming in is going to be a lot easier than waiting until something arrives and establishes and trying to deal with it after the fact. And so for our risk assessment, we had a few very simple questions. We wanted to look at who is going to arrive, who could potentially come into the Bering Sea. So what species are of risk? How are they going to get here? So if they're coming in on ships, which ports are of greater risk? And when and where? So which regions are they most likely to establish in? And is this like currently, if they land today, they can establish here? Or is this a future problem as oceans get warmer down the line? We need to worry about it in the future, but maybe not necessarily now. So in order to address these questions, we developed a ranking system to look at species that are in nearby regions and rank them to see which of these species may be the greatest threat for invading the Bering Sea. To look at ports of risk, we looked at shipping traffic data to say where are boats coming into, where is the most traffic coming, and these may be ports where we might see a higher likelihood of invasive species arriving. And then to look at the regions of risk, we modeled habitat suitability for each of the species that we ranked to look at if they arrive, is there actually suitable habitat for them to survive in? And is there currently habitat, or is this more of a future concern? So for our ranking system, I'm just going to touch on it super briefly, but in theory, ranking systems are used to look at threatened and endangered species, invasive species. They're used to kind of give us a relative idea of, when you look at species, which ones are of more concern. And so we looked at different invasive species ranking systems that were out there, and we modified one to work for the Bering Sea, and in particular, one that would work for an area where invasive species aren't really here yet. So to take into account how close are they, how far do they move, how likely are they to establish in the Bering Sea. And so this ranking system consisted of 33 questions over 5 themes, and 4 of these themes had points that contributed to the overall score. And so when we were trying to figure out, well, what species, if there's nothing here, what species do we actually rank? What do we actually look at? We used a geographic approach, and we said, okay, which species are closest? So you can see the Bering Sea is here. And so we went and we found all of the digitized occurrence records we could for invasive species, and digitized a bunch from the literature as well. And we said, okay, which species currently fall within 3 ecoregions away from the Bering Sea? And from these occurrence records, we found that there were 131 reported species that have been observed in nearby regions. And so of these 131 species, we ranked 46 of them. And so anything that fell within the Bering Sea or within the 2 ecoregions away, they were all included in the ranking process. And then a sub-selection of those that were 3 ecoregions away down into Washington were included as well. So in total, 46 species were ranked and habitat models were developed for. So in terms of the ranking, it's on a scale of 0 to 100. The lower the score, the lower the potential for invasion, or the lower impact that they'll have if they arrive. High is high potential, high impact. So it's high likelihood that they can get here based on their biology and the way that they move, and high impact in that places where they've been invasive elsewhere, they've caused major damage. So the likelihood of them causing damage in the Bering Sea is greater as well. And so by running these species through the ranking system, we can really focus on which species should we be concerned about. if managers and monitors have limited resources to look for invasive species that are arriving, this helps at least narrow the list of things that we should be watching for. And so our top 10 species are listed here that fell out of those 46 that we ran through the ranking system. And to give you an idea, the ranks on this top 10 ran from about 58 to 74 was the highest score on our biggest invader. And I think the three species that are really of interest here, European green crab and Divex, which is a tunicate. These are very aggressive invasive species that are further down the coast, and a lot of other places are really concerned about these species. They can cause a lot of damage. And then the Japanese skeleton shrimp, as I mentioned, is a species that has already been observed in the Bering Sea, and it's largely a hull fouling or a gear fouling species. So in terms of industry and them fouling nets and pots and all of that kind of stuff, they're a species that we definitely need to be thinking about. So that kind of gives us an idea of, well, who should we be looking for? And we have species-specific status reports that were written up for every single species that was ranked, with all of the literature and background information and rationale on why they were ranked certain ways. And those are all available on our website if you're interested in species-specific information or the ranking system itself. So the next thing is, how will they get there or here? And so when we dug into the literature for each species, we see that 100% of the species we looked at use anthropogenic vectors to get places. And of those species, we saw that about 70% of the ones we ranked foul boats or gear, so they move with ships on the outsides of ships. And about 55% of them get transported in ballast water. So when boats take water on, they pick up invasive species, and when they get to the Bering Sea and pour water out, they're releasing invasive species into the Bering Sea. So in order to look at, well, where is ballast water coming, and where are these ships going that may have fouling organisms on them, we went to the shipping data. And so this is kind of a map from AIS data that show a heat map of shipping traffic, and you can see there's a lot of traffic coming into the southern part of the Bering Sea. So some of the stats are in 2004, about 50% of all shipping traffic in the Arctic went through the Bering Sea. So we're getting a lot of boats that are in the Arctic coming through the Bering Sea. And by 2025, we expect 400 to 900 more vessels to start coming to the Bering Sea. And some of that is because Northwest Passage is opening up, so we might see more traffic coming in from the north, but it's also just that traffic in general is increasing. So we'll see more ships coming in from the south as well. So this idea is that if you have more ships coming in, there's more opportunity for invasive species to arrive as well. And so to look at this, we worked with Jordan Watson at NOAA, and he used two data sets looking at commercial and fishing vessels. And we summarized the number of trips, so how many boats are coming in, and the volume of ballast water. So how much of an opportunity do invasive species have to come into each of the ports that border the Bering Sea. And we looked at a 2-year time period just to get an idea of what's been happening over the last couple years, which ports actually are receiving the most traffic. And this is what we found. This is a chord diagram. So on the bottom, these are the ports of origin, so where boats are coming from. And on the top are the destination ports. And so the larger the chord, the more traffic a port is receiving. And so right off the bat, what we see is that Dutch Harbor is really receiving majority of the shipping traffic. Anyone who's worked with shipping traffic data was probably not surprised by that. But the other two ports of interest, I think, are Nome and Akutan. And so what this really does is it gives us an idea of, if we have limited resources to monitor, where should we be focusing our effort? And it seems like Dutch Harbor would be a pretty good place to start looking for the arrival of invasive species. And so this data that I'm showing is just for the commercial vessel trips, but the same trends and patterns held true for fishing vessels as well as ballast water. These three harbors kept popping up, these three ports, as places with increased risk of bringing in invasive species. And that just shows you on a map where they are. And so the third thing we wanted to do is, okay, we know who might be coming, we know where they might be coming in, but just because they arrive doesn't mean that they can survive or establish in the Bering Sea. So we wanted to say, okay, if they arrive, can they actually survive in these areas? So we went into the literature and we compiled a table of all of the species-specific thresholds we could find for water temperature and salinity. So what do these species need for survival in these areas? And so we came up with this is a little snippet of what the table looks like for two species, but we basically have temperature thresholds that run from a max to a min, and salinity thresholds as well. And so then we compared these tolerances to the conditions on the Bering Sea shelf. And we used 3 ROMS models, which show these values on a weekly basis. And we used 2 time periods. So we want to look at current, so 2003 to 2012. So if things arrive today, can they survive? And then future, so 2030 to 2039. If they arrive 20 years from now, is there a higher likelihood that they will survive versus now? And so this is one of our compiled maps, but basically for every species that we ran through the ranking system that we could find clear threshold values for, we developed a habitat suitability map. And so what I'm showing you here is just from one model for the current time period. And what we've done is we've stacked all of those species habitat suitability maps on top of each other. And what this is showing is that where it's dark red, that means that more species, more invasive species that we assessed have the potential to survive in those areas. So for example, this bright red shows that 35 of the species we developed habitat models for can survive year-round in these areas. When you get up into the dark green, 0 of the species we had developed habitat models for can survive there year-round. So it highlights areas that are of greater concern for the higher number of species arriving and being able to survive for year-round. And so an interesting thing to note is that kind of the threshold here where we move from lots of species to fewer species is this 0-degree isotherm that we see in the water. And as climate warms, we see that isotherm shifts northwards. So it's not surprising that we see something similar with the habitat models. And so here I've parsed it out. I've shown you all 3 models that we looked at. And this is current habitat suitability for species, year-round survival. And you can see there's slight differences between the models. And if I show you the future models projected out, we see that for the top 2 models, we have an additional species that currently was not able to survive in the Bering Sea is now able to survive. But more importantly, we do see this northward shift in habitat. So more habitat is opening up for invasive species. And so when we look at this kind of habitat suitability and the shipping traffic and see how they overlap, as I mentioned, so Nome up here in the north still falls in an area where not that many invasive species that we looked at have the potential for survival. It's still too cold for a lot of species up there. But when we look down at Dutch Harbor and Akitan down in the south here, we see that both of those overlap with high habitat suitability for a large number of species. So if you're limited in how much time or resources you have to monitor for invasive species, we're able to say, okay, there's a few species you should be looking for, and Dutch Harbor and Akitan may be a prime spot to start monitoring for those species. So I'm going to end with one quick little case study here. So in addition to survival of species, we also looked at reproduction and establishment of species. So it's not enough to just land and survive. You actually need to be able to reproduce and build a population in order to become and be considered an invasive species and have some damage in the ecosystem. And so in addition to survival thresholds, we also looked at reproduction and establishment thresholds. So here's the table from green crab. So you can see here that their establishment thresholds are much narrower. So they need warmer temperatures to reproduce and different salinities as well. And they also need between 42 to 59 days, consecutive days of these conditions in order to reproduce. So we consider all of these things in our models. And what we came up with is here's the survival, just to give you an idea of survival for green crab. So the scale here on the right runs from 0 to 52, which shows the average number of weeks in a year during that 10-year period that green crab can survive. So in the yellow, that's 52 weeks of the year, green crab can get dropped off in that area and survive. As you move further north, it gets lower. We're looking more about 20 weeks of the year. If a green crab got dropped off in Nome, it would be able to survive. But when the winter colder water and the ice came down, the population in theory wouldn't be able to survive those conditions. And so when we look at reproduction and establishment, we see a very, very different story. And so I'm changing the scale on you here a little bit. What this shows is that for that 10-year period, it's showing how many years had enough consecutive weeks with the temperature and salinity thresholds needed for reproduction that made suitable habitat. So how many years was there suitable habitat for long enough for green crab to reproduce? And so in our current models, the 10-year period, we see majority of the Bering Sea, none of the 10 years had conditions that were suitable for reproduction. When we look at the future models, we see that that's changing. And so we can see along the Aleutians and up towards the peninsula, we're seeing 6, 7, 8 of the years show that they would have conditions suitable for reproduction for a long enough period during that year. So we really do see that, I'll go back a minute again. So here currently, we don't really have a lot of places that are suitable for reproduction. But when we get into the future, we do see that for more years, we're seeing the suitable reproductive habitat for green crab. And if you remember the survival map, they can pretty much survive throughout most of the Bering Sea. So as the oceans warm and conditions get better, they're also going to be able to start to reproduce here as well. So in short, and again, we just briefly touched on a lot of this stuff, but please contact us for more information or more details or methods. But our ranking system lets us look at, okay, who should we be looking for? If we have limited resources, what are the top critters we should be watching for? Our transportation routes and shipping traffic gives us a good look at how will they get here and which ports should we maybe focus our monitoring efforts on. And our climate change and habitat suitability models let us look at, so which regions might these populations establish and when should we be worried? Is it a current issue or is this something, 10, 20 years down the line we need to really start taking seriously? And so of course, because this all has to do with performance elements, performance element 8.2.4, I think how this really addresses this is that our study helps us understand, or it gives us a lot of tools to start understanding how to monitor some of these processes to manage and mitigate the potential and realized threats from coastal invasive species. So while we're not doing the monitoring ourselves, there are a lot of managers and people and communities out there that are, and so this really provides some tools to start focusing resources or at least maximizing the resources that are out there. So with that, there's obviously a lot of acknowledgements. This is a hugely collaborative project with USGS and NOAA, ABCLCC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Sea Grant were essential in doing a lot of our outreach. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask now or email me, and our website's at the bottom there, www.beringinvaders.org.
Wow, thanks, Jessica. That was really fantastic. So I think we could take 5 minutes for questions about this sort of the specific presentation. I did forget to mention at the beginning of the meeting here that we do have some broader questions that we'd like to pose to the group for discussion, and those are on the agenda. But maybe if folks have specific questions about Jessica's presentation, we could take those for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to Rob's presentation.
Hi, Jessica. This is Jackie Grebmeyer. Do you have interface with some of the international groups as far as or plans for some type of monitoring collections on vessels that are going to come?
Yeah, we don't currently now. So our project was really doing the science behind figuring out what you should maybe be monitoring for and where. Obviously, if there's money available, we have all sorts of ideas of what should happen for monitoring. And we're happy to share any of our information with those who are already monitoring. But we do not currently have plans to monitor, and we haven't, since this project is just wrapping up now, we haven't really talked to anyone. But Amanda's here as well, so she might have more information.
Well, yeah, no, we actually have tried to contact a few Russian researchers that we knew of or had heard of that had been working on invasive species, but we either didn't hear back from them or they told us that this wasn't an active area of research for them currently. So if there are any connections to be made. I think we have some good contacts on the Pacific Northwest and in BC, but we're always looking to expand that, especially since our habitat models do extend out towards the Russian coast. So if there are connections to be made, we'd be more than happy to be put in touch with those people. We'd love to hear what they think and what their needs are for this issue.
Okay, and then just to follow up, and I'll stop, is there any interface with the state? Because you could put, settling place or something related to some measurements at some of these sites that could a local community, could be involved with some of the, measurements, even by visual on those plates, by taking pictures, something maybe could have a community connection, something that a high school project could be involved in. It's just something to think about.
Yeah, and so we did have U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Kendra, she was out at Camp Kagayu and Bering Sea Days and did, I think she did some plates and she did some outreach with the kids out there. They've been doing some work in Homer. So a curriculum has been developed. We have staff and there's protocols for putting plates out through Plate Watch. So there's definitely opportunities for communities to get involved, to help out. And Fish and Game does, I'm sure most of you know about it, but they do have an online reporting system for invasive species. So I do, and we have talked a lot with ABCLCC, ADFNG, and just figuring out, what are the next steps? How do we get people involved, and how do we make these resources available so that when people do want to get involved, it's very easy for them to set things up or report or that sort of thing.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions on the presentation? Okay, well, maybe we'll move on to Rob Kaler's presentation. And Rob, I don't know if you were able to get onto Zoom or if we're gonna just run through your PDF and Jessica Meredith can help with that.
I would appreciate Meredith's help. We had an all-employee meeting, so I think that's where my IT folks are, and they haven't gotten back to me. I think my machine wiped off the Zoom meeting program, so if Meredith can help.
Yeah, so.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So my name is.
Go ahead, Rob. You're all set.
Should I just launch? All right. So we title page: Seabird die-offs in Alaska, the Bob El Nino, warming oceans, and harmful algal blooms, with a list of co-authors, which is never complete because this has been a monumental task. Again, this is. I'm going to kind of drill into the big one, 2015-2016 MRREC, but then kind of give an example. Going into more detail and then skimming over what's happened in the last year and a half, essentially. And kind of a little bit more focused to whom I thought would be an audience Alaska bound, but since it's broader, I guess I'll go into a little bit more detail. The presentation itself has quite a few slides to it, and that was just my intention to help market and expand some of our efforts to respond to these efforts. So I'll go pretty quickly through many of the slides, but I just wanted to make sure that there was a PDF that people could refer back to. So there are a couple slides that are for marketing purposes and expansion of some of our response efforts. So next slide, please. So as John had mentioned, kind of the overarching topics that he had suggested to Jessica and I, so essentially, how can communities report to changes they see? I'm going to hopefully get more into that, as well as who are the folks that are actually responsible for the monitoring, the reporting, and then where are these information being shared? So making sure that people who help collect these bits of reports and data also get to see that information reported back to them, and as well as put it into the larger scale in terms of the Bering or the Gulf of Alaska or Alaska-wide. And then lastly, what monitoring research is ongoing or could be better. And so the example from the 2015-2016 MRREC, that was kind of an unprecedented monumental event that I learned a lot from, and so I think we are much better prepared communication-wise, network-wise, and so largely a success story, but there's always room for improvement. So next slide, please. So I guess as as I was mentioning, the 2015-2016 MER rec, and using the term rec because it's a little bit more poetic than mortality event or seabird die-off. Essentially, we'd started getting reports in 2015. The first report came in from Seward, and I think it was somebody who'd been walking their dog along the beach in Seward. And fortunately, with our partners at the Alaska Sea Life Center, we were able to have trained folks go and collect the carcasses. It turned out to be 3 MERS. And so we were able to get those expedited up to Anchorage here, and then FedEx overnight to our partners at the USGS National Wildlife Health Center in Madison. The picture that you're seeing on the screen now, this was actually on New Year's Day in 2016. David Irons, a retired biologist here in migratory bird management, took his family down to Whittier. He was actually checking on a friend's boat, and when he looked over on one of the beaches, it hadn't been a particularly snowy year, and he said, "That's strange, that looks like little bundles of snow." And so he and his family proceeded to go and investigate, and ended up counting within a little bit more than a mile of beach, nearly 8,000 carcasses, and they had freshly come up onto the beach. So that was, we'd been getting quite a few reports beginning in November of observations of birds of MERS inland. We had them up on the Cook Inlet, which is a very flat, tidally influenced area that relatively unheard of for a MER to come up, and there's really no food there either. So there's a number of strange observations being made, and this 8,000 or nearly 8,000 birds on a beach in Whittier, Alaska was kind of that of course set off quite a media scourge, and we started getting phone calls from just about everywhere on the planet, and the AP Press, everybody putting out articles. Essentially, we didn't know what was happening, was how all these articles, birds die, researchers scratch heads, that kind of thing. So next slide, please. So the birds that we were being able to collect from these beaches over quite a long period of time and sent to the USGS National Wildlife Health Center, by and large, the cause of death was determined to be due to emaciation, starvation, and then exposure, essentially. So why were birds starving, essentially? Well, I wanted to give a quick slide. Seabird diets. We use seabirds as indicators of the health of the marine ecosystem. They're abundant. They're easy to monitor for the most part. They come to shore to breed, or come to the mainland to breed, or onto islands. And so they lend themselves to being able to serve as a barometer for ocean conditions and changes in those conditions. So, and why is that? Well, they're an apex predator. And I've shown a slide here that shows some of the potential food, and I've focused this particularly on MERS, but the spring, summer, fall and diets, to be frank, we really don't know that much about their winter diets. They're offshore many times, foraging off the continental shelf, for the example of the MERS in the Gulf of Alaska. But essentially what you can lump is they like forage fish, really fat, healthy, protein-rich forage fish like the Pacific sand lance. And here I've given some examples. The slide itself is actually from Aaron Burkett and John Pyatt at the USGS, but kind of showing that these sand lances are near shore and pretty consistent populations. Then you go to capelin. Well, that's a cold water associate. And there's a point in which in Alaska, they talk about a 1976, 1977 regime shift. And that's essentially where they saw, ocean record, temperature-wise going from a cold or a cool ocean and increasing to a warmer ocean. And so after that 1976 regime shift, there's several papers that discuss it. You see a decrease in capelin and then an increase in the next species down, the juvenile walleye pollock. Walleye pollock, while doing well with warmer temperatures compared to the cold water associated capelin, they're just not as nutritious. And then of course euphausiids, many folks within the forage fish community almost consider euphausiids to be a type of forage fish. Some of them are quite large and nutritious. And this is an example of something that they're probably consuming a lot more euphausiids than we actually know about. Largely what we have been able to quantify at nests, quantify in seabird diets is largely monitoring what they bring to their young at the nest. So we have a much better idea about summer into fall, but very little about those swing seasons, the spring and the winter. So you can do things like stable isotopes or fatty acid analyses. And that kind of helps you at least get a little bit better idea of what part of the trophic food web they are consuming. And so they might be eating quite a bit more euphausids, particularly in the winter, than we've previously knew. And at the bottom, I give an example of the metabolic rate, or how much energy these animals need to live in the ocean. And MERS is the example here, where every day they consume between 10 and 30% of their body weight, and depending on the size of the fish, that can be anywhere from 90 fish to 300 fish per day. So that's pretty substantial. One other thing about MERS is they're actually able to dive to pretty good depths. And so if MERS aren't able to locate food, that's another red flag, since they do seem to be a lot more flexible in their abilities to get to depth and eat additional fish. Next slide, please. So going back to that beach in Whittier, this is a screen capture from Windy TY. I think it's been rebranded Windy TV. But here it's showing winds, and this is right around that peak in January. It was the end of January, or sorry, the end of December into January, and we'd had quite a severe storm surge, or several storms, and this is kind of showing the winds. And at the top of that pink area, and I wish I had my mouse, I'd hover over it, but the uppermost part, that's the Prince William Sound. And to that farthest upper left corner, that's Whittier, essentially. And so this is kind of showing that you've got these extreme winds, and they're all really funneling. So wherever those MERS actually died, we really have no idea. And while Whittier typically is not what we would consider a catcher beach, something that the currents are generally flowing and bringing things onto, good beaches for beach combing. So this is an example of what, the storm surge. So whatever is happening to these birds, unable to find food, perhaps getting exposed to some toxin or whatnot, or a myriad, and then you have a storm system come in, kind of an insult to injury, if you will. And so, and what I'm showing here, I haven't spent much time in the Bering or a little bit more in the Aleutians, but as I understand what you see here, this is sometimes called Tuesday in the Bering Sea area. Sometimes it's Thursday, but being a joke that there's always some, and Gay Shetfield can answer to that, but there's seems to be at least two, pretty significant storms per month, especially in the winter time. So, but again, this is an example of how if an animal's already at the edge, you get a storm like this, and that can be that breaking point. Next slide, please. So how would you monitor 8,000 dead carcasses up on a beach? Well, just quickly cutting to our, essentially my savior in terms of being able to get out and coordinate and quantifying what is a normal baseline of birds dying and arriving up on a beach and then getting counted. So out of the University of Washington, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, the acronym being COAST, has an army of citizen scientists, and they were very active in the lower 48 from Northern California up to Washington. And then they got their foot in the door officially in 2007 in Alaska. So the data that I'm about to show in the next slide, just kind of a brief glimpse of what type of information is provided by these coastal surveys. The COAST idea is to go out and repeatedly survey a stretch of beach about 1 kilometer long once a month throughout the entire year. And that, there's more details to that, but basically the idea is to capture baseline information on how many birds typically die and are counted on a beach. And there's predators, there's the tide. I mean, there's several factors influencing it, but generally just coming up with what's normal. Because as we know, marine mammals die, wash up on the beach, birds die, wash up on the beach, birds senescent die, and so what is normal? Next slide, please. So this is an example. So what we call this Coast Citizen Science folks coasters. And so this is showing 2015 data in the yellow, and then in the gray, the smaller circles. That's the long-term average. And long-term, again, going back to 2007 when Coast really started ramping up their presence in Alaska. In May, as you see on the left side of the screen, in the parentheses is the number of beaches that were surveyed. So on 33 beaches in May, what you see here is that generally the answer would be 0 birds on these beaches. In 2015, you see that there's a magnitude more than that. As you move to the right, June with 32 beaches, you see what the normal rate of deposition of a seabird on, or a carcass on a beach. And again, and basically you see by end of December that there's quite a spike. And again, showing the long-term averages compared to what was being counted in 2015. So definitely something unusual happening across the entire Gulf of Alaska in this case. Next slide, please. So going back to MER wrecks, so they're not unprecedented. They're well documented within the literature. We know they happen on both the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast. So it's not unusual. Next slide, please. And here's kind of a list of previous seabird die-offs in Alaska. And so going back to the 70s, I think that was probably the first well-documented one on the Alaska Peninsula, an estimated 190,000 MERS had died. And then to 2014, where you see it, and this is actually, 2013, that was actually associated, that was at St. Lawrence Island. I think Gay helped respond to that one. And that was actually found once we got birds collected and sent, once Gay got birds collected and sent to us and sent to the National Wildlife Health Center, it came back positive for avian cholera. So that was actually a first record for seabirds with avian cholera. So, and then looking at this, well, why are these events, why do they happen? Well, next slide, please. So here I've gone to the NOAA site and kind of just looked at what they consider their hallmark El Niños. So 2015-16, of course, was a very large El Nino event, or a significant El Nino event. But as you look here, you can kind of see a corresponding, not so much with 1970, but 1983, you see 82 was a significant El Nino. 93, 94, 1997, that was a significant El Nino. And so these warmer water conditions, generally you do see seabirds die off during those events, largely because the fish that they're eating are so sensitive to thermoclines and changes in that they might redistribute or perhaps even perish. But regardless, the food not being there, so that's usually when we see these die-off events. So just that connection to an El Nino year and that warmer water that comes in. Next slide, please. So what was different in this 2015-2016 die-off? Well, the geographic extent. Most of these die-offs in the past have been really, regionally isolated. Alaska Peninsula, perhaps up into the Bering or the, but this event extended all the way from southeast into the Alaska Peninsula. The temporal extent, that timeline, we started getting reports in May. Those reports continued into the following 2016 May. So that's pretty prolonged period for these types of events compared, why we're using terms like unprecedented to describe this MER wreck. The magnitude, the sheer numbers, some of the surveys that were conducted by the USGS and Prince William Sound, doing counts and necropsies, field necropsies, but essentially coming up with over 60,000 dead birds estimated just from the Prince William Sound area. That doesn't include any of the other Gulf of Alaska. So overall, we're looking at probably 200,000 plus dead carcasses due to this die-off. And the other thing would be that those dots inland, I had mentioned seeing birds in the Upper Cook Inlet, which is just outside the window here in Anchorage. Well, that's tidally influenced. It's very shallow, and it's really, we don't see a lot of seabirds using that. I mean, very unusual, let alone these interior birds. I think they had Christmas bird count records for common MERS up in Fairbanks. And so those types of observations, here I was getting phone calls from folks running trapping lines, seeing birds that were actually MERS, a flock of MERS foraging on an open lead in one of the rivers, essentially flying up the river where it was open, getting in the water and presumably foraging for whatever they could find as they floated down. So just very unusual and a good use for the term unprecedented. Next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, the emaciation or the starvation, this is actually this slide is from John Pyatt at the Alaska Science Center. On the bottom in the red, this was a die-off in 1993 that John and Tom Van Pelt had documented and did a lot of studies to try to determine, how many had died and how many were being counted. But what you see in that dotted vertical line, the approximate phase 3 starvation threshold, that's about 675 grams. That's kind of the tipping point. And this is, the phase 3 is a clinical terminology, but essentially this is where it's thought that birds, once they pass that mass, they're likely to succumb to any of the environmental issues. The slide just above in the brown, this is common MERS, and as you see, it's straddling that phase 3 starvation threshold. And this was 2015 to 2016. And then Sarah Shane with the USGS Alaska Science Center was out in Prince William Sound, and as I'd mentioned, they'd estimated about 60,000, but they're also doing field necropsies, trying to get an assessment of what sex, was it males or females, was it young of the year or adults perishing. But essentially you see that the masses on the birds that they were getting, they weren't really past that threshold. And then the top in the green, this is what we would consider normal. So again, going back to that yellow, the second panel down from the top, from that, it's really hard. They are, again, they should be weighing a little over 1,000 grams. So they are light. They are not doing well, but they're not past that phase 3 threshold. So from this, we kind of infer that perhaps something else more sinister might be happening in the environment, but it's very hard to determine that. Really, we just have, from the National Wildlife Health Center, no infectious disease, no non-infectious disease, avian influenza negative, everything was negative, no abnormal parasite loads. And so again, the second panel showing you that, they were in poor condition, but they weren't over that phase 3 starvation threshold. Next slide, please. So why are birds dying? We sent 106 carcasses to the National Wildlife Health Center. All of them came back, cause of death, starvation, emaciation. They had lack of food, nothing in their GI tracts, nothing in their stomachs. They had very little fat, if any, on their body. Again, no infectious disease. And so the next step was to test for algal toxins, specifically domoic acid and saxitoxin. One of the issues with doing that is that you generally need contents within the stomach or the GI tract. And since these birds were starved, very few of the birds actually had any kind of contents to be tested for harmful algal blooms, for those biotoxins, saxitoxin and domoic acid. But so 106 of the birds examined, they were all ruled to have died due to emaciation. Next slide, please. So doing some of the testing with NOAA and the Greenwater Lab in Washington State, it came back that, yeah, there were some trace levels in some of the birds. Essentially, 7 of the 19 murre carcasses had very low levels. Everything was negative, or no detection of domoic acid. But we can't draw a lot of conclusions from this statement about trace levels found in these 7 of 19 murres. We know that saxitoxin is a neurotoxin, and exposure might affect their behavior and their feeding abilities. And then if you add on top of that a compromised body condition due to emaciation, but we really don't have any, there's no clinical reports or examination into how a seabird may be affected by this saxitoxin. Next slide, please. So kind of as a summary, why are the birds starving? Well, we knew we had a warm water event. We had the blob, this unusually large mass of warm water in the Gulf of Alaska, actually stretching down all the way to Baja. And so that might actually be affecting the predators as well as the prey, meaning that the prey, these, whether it's the euphausiids, the krill, or if it's actual forage fish, that it's either affecting them, redistributing them, or perhaps it's minimizing their abundance. There's an idea that murres need to have a certain mass of fish in a school to efficiently be able to forage. Again, they've got such a high metabolic rate that if they're expending more energy than they're actually getting back from the prey captured, then that could be a tipping point as well. And again, yeah, the species distribution abundance, perhaps they're moving to other areas, or perhaps their numbers are down. That being the krill and the krill, that essentially zooplankton that feeds the entire food web. The other effect, of course, the harmful algal blooms. You got warmer water, you have more frequency of these algae blooms, and then the biotoxins associated with those. And this could have ramifications throughout the food web, all the way down to those prey species, again, the zooplankton. yeah, there were some trace levels, but we really can't say much about that. And so at this point, we say starvation was due to lack of food in the system, but there's other factors that may be at play as well. So starvation was the key factor, but there likely may have been other contributing factors. And again, going back to this figure from John Pyatt showing that while they were in poor body condition, they had not passed that phase 3 starvation threshold. Next slide, please. So, so that MRREC we thought wrapped up by around the end of April. And then in October 2016, from some folks in the Pribilof Islands, specifically St. Paul, Lauren Devine, and then Pamela and Paul and Aaron at the Aleut community helped respond to a puffin die-off. Again, Julia Parrish and Hillary Burgess of the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team were really important partners, both as an between the agencies and Lauren and those folks at St. Paul, but as well as developing kind of a quick and dirty method. So again, as I mentioned, the COAST protocol is to adopt a beach, walk that beach once a month throughout the entire year to get baseline information as well as capture these die-off events. A quick and dirty method that was come up with was essentially when you do see this, if you don't already have a beach that you've adopted perhaps, but you could go out and get information that can be collated together. And so all these anecdotal reports from across Alaska, that was one of the issues in 2015, 2016 with the MRREC was we just had reports coming in. My phone was ringing, emails, getting reports from the state. So this, we were, after the 2015, 2016 MRREC, I think as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that we kind of had our communication and our network much more figured out than we had during that crisis, essentially. Of course, it was really hard to respond to that many die-offs at one time, but next slide, please. So essentially this mortality event was largely tufted puffins, started about mid-October. Last report of dead puffins was the end of November. And based on the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team data that the folks at St. Paul had been contributing to since 2007, we could actually, well, the royal we could actually say that the rate of carcass deposition at St. Paul on those long-term study beaches was about, at a minimum, was 300 times what would normally be found on that beach. So essentially saying that, you would have seen 6 carcasses. Well, this time you saw 217 carcasses. So next slide, please. So again, sending some of those carcasses to the USGS National Wildlife Health Center. Cause of death was determined to be starvation. These birds were in poor physical shape, had nothing in their stomachs. And then, of course, the infectious and non-infectious diseases came back negative. In this case, we were not able to test for saxitoxin domoic acid. That, again, the lack of GI tract contents and stomach contents or cloacal contents. So next slide, please. And then the most recent one, and Gay and Brandon were monumental in both reporting, getting the observations, but as well as getting carcasses from the field to here in Anchorage so that we could then forward them on to the National Wildlife Health Center for examination. I'd also like to mention that the USGS Alaska Science Center had started a harmful algal bloom lab. So there was great communication between the National Wildlife Health Center and the Alaska Alaska Science Center to do some of that testing for saxitoxin domoic acid. So this is kind of a quick, these are snippets from a presentation that I gave to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council at the end of December or early December. So moving forward. So this is just a quick summary. You can see on this map was actually provided by COAST, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team. They were excellent partners in this round, in particular being able to collate all these reports from far-flung stretches of the Bering, the Chukchi, Bering Strait region. And again, Gay and Brandon were really monumental in getting those information, those reports sent to us. So, as well as our partners at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, they were also, in fact, I think they were the first ones to ring the bell of alarm. One of their techs had been at St. Paul and came back and told the the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge staff that he'd seen several, dead fulmars. So just quickly, again, our collaboration with Coast on this, they counted about 1,600 birds over this period from early June to September, the die-off seeming to have ended around the end of September. We got 21 carcasses collected and sent to the National Wildlife Health Center. And then of those, there was some materials for the Alaska Sea Life, the USGS Alaska Science Center to do testing for saxitoxin and domoic acid. Next slide, please. What did we learn? Essentially, again, cause of death appeared to be due to emaciation, just like the 2015-2016 MER wreck. Results from Caroline Van Hermert at the Alaska Science Center. She validated some of the higher levels that she had detected in her samples with the NOAA Beaufort lab in North Carolina. And so 17 of those carcasses did have presence. Sorry, I don't think 17 is right. Let me look at my notes. These are the details that I don't want to screw up, especially with Caroline on the phone.
5 of 17.
5 of 17, thank you. Excellent. So essentially, cutting to the chase, results indicated that birds were exposed to saxitoxin, but there was no clear connection to the cause of death being due to that exposure. And again, to put it in human consumption, it was below what is recommended for shellfish. Domoic acid was not detected. And again, while there was no evidence of toxicity owing to saxitoxin, it's possible that that exposure might have been a contributing factor. Next slide, please. So this is, again, basically just what I told you. This was a collaborative one-page handout that everybody was able to provide their input. Gay, again, was really helpful on this process. And then that link at the top is just so that you could download it. I also, last night, uploaded this to, it should be accessible via the IARP or website. So next slide, please. So along with this coastal observation and seabird survey team, I also wanted to emphasize that the local environmental observer network, as well as Bering Watch, are also key partners in this effort to try to get kind of these anecdotal reports or observations from these remote areas and getting those all consolidated in one place. And so one of the things when you have multiple places for people to submit reports is, one, if they're going to be really prudent about it, that they would have to submit them to 3 different areas just to make sure that everybody was on board. And that so getting behind the scenes, and I think Coast Local Observation, the LEO network, as well as Bering Watch are communicating and are working towards getting a more consolidated reporting method so that information reported to one site is also shared with the others. And so getting back to the part about how can coastal communities report changes they see, well, there's the Coastal Observation Seabird Survey Team, there's the LEO network, and then there's Bering Watch. So I would encourage everybody to get to help us get these 3 different organizations essentially into making them household names, if you will. Essentially that people know that if they see dead and dying birds or mammals or unusual, and that be it invasive, things that they hadn't seen, that there's an opportunity to get your voice heard, get those reports documented, and then you can actually see how broad scaled they are. And so I spend a lot of time sitting at a computer, talking on the phone and emailing people. And so it's really the folks out in the field that I rely heavily on. In fact, I stand on their shoulders, folks like Gay, of course, getting that information reported into us. And then of course, I think going on, like, where does that information, where does it get posted and how do we get it back into the communities? Making these one-page handouts is one way to do it, but making sure that we have a network, individuals within those communities that we can use as kind of our, the conduit to get that information back. And of course, that encourages people to remain engaged. That's one of the issues that Coast has been facing with essentially getting beaches and getting folks to monitor the beaches, that when you have a normal year, if you will, meaning that there are very few birds to report, people kind of, a beach will blink out if you think, essentially it gets boring, but those are the beaches that become, you know, inundated. That beach in Whittier, it rarely has anything washed up on it. And there one day it was 8,000 dead birds. So just an example, but of course, you know, community engagement, Coast is doing a fantastic job, the Leo Network and Bering Watch as well. So I would just encourage everybody to, you know, get involved with these sites, get your account set up and follow along. And you'll, the more engaged we are, the better these sites will work and the better we'll have a finger on the pulse. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of what I've been getting at. This would be somewhat of my summary slide. You know, how can we prepare for future events? And when I gave the presentation to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, one of the council members, apparently I'd sounded quite sardonic, but I'd addressed the council 3 times in the last year about seabird die-off. And so my comment was, well, if you continue to see me here, we know that something's wrong. And so being that, if indeed these die-off events continue at the rate that they are right now, and I hope they don't, but now is the time to say, well, what did we wish that we'd done 3 years ago? And you know, soon it'll be 6 years ago. And so getting involved, engaging this adopted beach within the citizen science, and also being involved in the die-off alert protocol. It's a super easy way to contribute information that you see from essentially your backyard, if you will. And then linking the die-off alert protocol, these reports of observations with the Leo Network as well as Bering Watch. The protocols that Coast has developed, this die-off alert protocol, it's quick, it's easy, and it's really valuable in terms of getting these anecdotal reports consolidated. Also going, you know, during these mass die-offs, getting some kind of idea of what is the age of birds being affected and the gender of those birds, and then overall body condition. And with these die-offs, and it's been really fantastic to have the USGS Alaska Science Center get a harmful algal bloom lab up and going. It's provided a tremendous better view into what might actually be happening in the system. And Caroline and her coworkers are also looking at how to test other tissues as well, since many of these birds don't have any stomach contents that perhaps as a proxy. So Caroline has been looking at liver as well as muscle tissue to kind of give at least a presence absence level of inference. So next slide, please.
Hey, and Rob, if you wouldn't mind wrapping up, I wouldn't mind having just like the last 10 minutes just for a little bit of discussion among everyone who's still on the phone. Yep,
I'm there now. So if you're in Alaska for the Alaska Forum for the Environment Tuesday, their Coast is hosting a die-off alert training and discussion. So I think that was also uploaded to the website to share that flyer. And with that, that's my contact information. I'm always available for questions and emails. So thanks a lot.
Right, thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, so as always, you know, we often allow these talks or the meetings to go on for an hour and a half so we can have more of a discussion, but we often find ourselves talking about other things. So I really appreciate the presenters. And Gay Sheffield called in, and I specifically wanted to get her perspectives on being someone who's been a liaison with coastal communities and with agencies and other groups that are responding to these events. So Gay, if you wouldn't mind just sharing any perspectives you have, having watched the presentations. I know we only have 10 minutes, but if you could give us a quick summary of some of your thoughts. And then if we have time, I wouldn't mind just quickly addressing one more question that's on our agenda.
Okay, sure. Thank you. And thank you to the presenters. Invasive species and bird die-offs are something that we've been dealing or on the lookout for. I just want to mention briefly from starting about, just to give you a rough idea of the kind of events in the Bering Strait region in a rural to the responder's perspective or remote location. We've dealt with, in the last 7 years, we've lost 3 vessels that have potentially released over 100,000 gallons. We've had the first unified command stood up in the Arctic at St. Lawrence Island in 2012. We continue to have marine debris from ships. We've dealt with the first federally designated unusual mortality event starting in 2011. that involved 4 species of ice seals. Rob mentioned the avian cholera event in 2013 at St. Lawrence Island. And this year we had seabird die-off. I think Rob was very generous in giving me so much credit, but really it was a lot of networking on our tribal, at the different tribes and the different communities, and Coeric subsistence program as well. We work very closely together. And we have some evidence of a saxitoxin event in walruses. We do have, for the invasive species folks, in 2003, we had the Hamasaki crab first identified up here and then has established itself. And we have dealt with several dead bowhead entanglements and ship strikes. My point is that we have a lot going on that we're responding to, and the responders are far away, and multiple agencies, multiple different kinds of events. And there's been about 5 or 6 lessons learned, kind of overall lessons learned. And I was going to just kind of rattle those off if that would be helpful to the group, because they're sort of comprehensive. I've had to think about, you know, what have we learned dealing with Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Coast Guard, so forth and so on, again and again, with really different protocols, really different, we want them in our region to make the problem understandable and correct it if possible. So should I just proceed, or does anyone have any questions?
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay, so the first lesson learned is that communities with active maritime subsistence are the ones most likely to discover anomalous events, and they alert their regional partner institutions. And I'm talking Bering Strait because that's where I'm from. And out here, we are more remote. Please do not think we do not talk about each other all the time, because we gossip like heck. We have regional communication networks, and I know that is confounding probably if you don't know how they work, if you're far away, but that is one thing I really would like to point out, that communities with active maritime subsistence discover and are observing the environment and the conditions, the marine resources, and they will alert regional partner institutions. The second is that response agencies that have integrated in regional communication networks and also are using traditional ecological knowledge are most effective in their response. And by that, I mean not coming in and you know, if they're integrated in our regional communication networks, and again, this is maybe Bering Strait specific, but I think it would probably work up north as well, where we have really different communication and different uses of our marine resources, such as, well, different uses of our marine resource. So to be most effective as a response agency, get integrated in your regional communication network for where you're trying to be. Not just go to that one hot spot that seems to be having a problem at the moment. Integrate with the people that and the institutions that are in our case in the north, in transportation hubs. Then I only got 3 more. One is it would be great to have agencies and communications who have wildlife health networks or wildlife health response plans to review those plans and update them annually. We unfortunately, you know, it's amazing. We have fantastic plans in place, the Unified Command, but because they aren't reviewed or looked at both on the local communities end, but also on the response agencies end, there can be much confusion even though you have a plan, and many of the contact information may be expired. And it's a great way to educate, communicate, integrate if we did something like that on an annual level for all the different types of response that everyone's expecting, at least in our Bering Strait maritime world. Lack of regional scientific data does not mean lack of local knowledge, so that is that's a standalone. And I'll keep moving. Then basically that is the local knowledge in our areas are very rich and can help regional scientists and people who are looking at the region. Investigations of contaminated wildlife or anomalous wildlife or your invasive species or whatever must consider research and management issues in terms of public health and food security concerns when you are on the western and northern coast of Alaska, and probably the rest of the state. I don't want to speak out of turn for anyone living south, but your research and management needs have to be couched in terms of public health and food security concerns, especially during a response. And then lastly, because I live in the Bering Strait region and we are closer to our neighbors in the west than we are to Anchorage, it is ethically responsible to alert Chukotka regarding any public health concerns and shared marine wildlife population issues. They are very close to us and physically, and they are also accessing the same marine wildlife that we are, and they definitely have the same public health and animal health concerns, but they don't have the benefit of the response network and agencies that are available to us and that we are so grateful for in Alaska. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabe. That's really helpful to have all those lessons learned down on paper for all of us. So, Meredith, I don't know if you have any last minute announcements. If not, we could try to take one or two more comments or questions.
Yeah, I have no announcements.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I don't know if anyone else has any follow-up discussion items or questions or comments based on what we talked about today.
This is Gay. I have an announcement.
Okay.
I've been, and it's for, and especially for Rob, I've been traveling this past 2 weeks through the Bering Strait region, returned the other day from Diomede and Shishmaref, and we have not only unprecedented open water conditions in the strait, but this year we have birds already here. Cormorants at Diomede, eider ducks at Shish, all the way up to Barrow, actually. And I just wanted to let people know we're looking at a pretty unusual winter conditions. Murres, gulls, cormorants, whatnot at Diomede already. So I know, Rob, you may find that of interest. I don't know if you've heard about that, but that is where we are at right now.
Yeah, I'd seen some, this is Rob, I'd seen some emails cycle, and then Liz Labunsky said she ran into at the AMSS. So yeah, and then Paul Lehman with his counterpart, Clarence Irigu at St. Lawrence, he sometimes sends out some posts to the Alaska Bird Listserv. And yeah, just different times, but yeah, those are great reports to share out.
That's it, thank you.
Any other comments?
No, this is Jackie. I just, there's a lot of questions I have, but I'm going to talk to Gay afterwards. But I think both of these presentations were very informative, and I wanted to thank the speakers.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a point or a question in the chat box for you, Gay. It says, do you have a suggested contact in Chukotka, Russia, for any information that we might want to share?
For that, you know, I don't know how much federal to federal can go on, but I would go through Chukotkinro in Onadir. That's their federal biologist for the Chukotka region. I don't know if you want, you know, I don't know where the caller want or who asking the question where they're looking for specifically, but Onadir is the hub for Chukotka. That is sort of the capital, and Chukotkinro is their federal biologist organization.
Okay.
This is
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say this is Caroline Van Hemer, and if folks have more questions about algal toxin testing, I'd be happy to answer them as well. We just did a poster at AMSS on additional samples tested from that 2015-2016 MER die-off event. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. It's 11:30, so I should let everyone go.